Let's go to Canada, to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Françoise Bédis teaches philosophy at Dalhousie University. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
Now, once again, he hasn't published yet in any journal. There's skepticism about whether or not this is true. What's your reaction to what you just heard?
Well, I actually listened to this late last night because I think many people who are invested in this area wanted to hear directly from the source what it is that he was claiming he had done. So he did, in fact, present a fair bit of data which suggests that something definitely happened. He answered questions from the audience, both about the science and the ethics, and he seemed pretty convinced that what he had done was ethically defensible.
Is it ethically defensible?
I clearly think not, and I think that largely the international community has responded with a similar perspective. And the reason for this is multifaceted. On the one hand, many people would be concerned about issues of safety and efficacy. So the concern here would be prematurity. Other people aren't actually interested in whether the timing was right and whether or not the scientific community, had the science where it needed to be. They would object to this in principle, even if the science was confirmed, shall we say. And I have to say that I'm siding with that for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not clear that this would be an appropriate indication for the kind of work that he was doing. And let me just remind everybody, what he's doing is changing the DNA of the human embryo. So the person who's born is going to have genetically modified DNA. And more importantly, every child they give birth to will have that same genetically modified DNA, and so on through the generations.
So what you're suggesting there is that
you're thinking about
just what you're suggesting there is that there's a big difference between designing DNA, which is what you're talking about, and for instance, screening eggs and sperm for, say, Down syndrome or other diseases.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The difference there is between selection and design. And you're actually moving into a whole new realm of manipulation. Once you're not just looking at what's in the dish and making a choice, but you're actually starting to tinker with that DNA.
So here in France, it's both that are illegal, design and selection. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm actually surprised to hear that the selection is also illegal in France. And the reason for that is typically in most first world countries or high income countries, there is an understanding of reproductive rights, which allows a woman to make decisions over her body and her reproduction. And typically in that context, it means that women have access to prenatal testing on the basis of which they would make choices about which pregnancies they will or will not continue. Now, having said that, there are people who would object to that on the grounds that this is eugenic.
So there are those who argue in favor of Hugh Jung-Kim, saying, well, why not have babies who we know if you've come from a family that has a high risk of cancer or heart disease, why not make sure that it doesn't happen to the next generation?
There certainly are a number of people who think this kind of research is important and should go forward, but perhaps at a slower pace. I think that what's being lost here is a big picture understanding of what happens when humans, who are fallible, try to take over the human evolutionary story and basically try to direct what the next and subsequent generations are going to look like. So that's a real concern. And the second really big concern that I and many other people have is the likely divide between the haves and the have-nots, as those with wealth and power are able to actually entrench that privilege in their DNA. That's a problem.
Which scares you more, the rise of artificial intelligence that we may create, well, Frankenstein monsters, or what we're witnessing here, which is tinkering and perhaps creating, quote, superhumans?
Well, I actually think that one of the things we're not paying attention to is that it'll never be either or. In fact, these technologies will be used in tandem and other technologies as well. And I think that's the kind of synchronicity we really ought to be thinking about. There's no one technology that will be used in isolation. So, yes, I think at one time most people were worried about biotechnology. Today, many more people are worried about artificial intelligence. We ought to be equally worried about both and how they'll intersect.
And whose job is it to worry about it? Can there be a worldwide body that everybody defers to on these ethical issues?
Well, you've actually touched on the topic that's dearest to my heart. So my answer to that question is all of us. And what that means is that we actually all have a responsibility to increase our science literacy and our ethics literacy. Because in fact, I don't think we can defer to any other authority. It isn't about deciding, is it going to be UNESCO? Are we going to look at the Oviedo Convention? Are we going to establish a new authoritative group? I don't think we can afford the risk of deferring to elites on this question, because this question is about the human genome, and the human genome belongs to all of us.
Finally, Françoise Bélis, the more you study on this, the more fearful are you? I mean, there's just the sense that, well, we don't know what we're playing with here.
I think we certainly don't know what we're playing with. Where I'm hopeful is that right now, I think we are and have for a long time been on a trajectory where everything is distorted through capitalism. And I think that one of the things I'm hopeful about is that we will in fact see that if we continue along this path, greed and stupidity are going to get us into real trouble. So how can we pull back? How can we look at what we're doing to our environment in terms of climate change, in terms of pollution, in terms of water, in terms of food security? These are all threats to humanity. And I think one of the things we need to think about is what is it that we're doing in terms of what we think is progress that is going to either answer or correct those threats such that we have a chance of surviving in this environment.
Françoise Bélis, many thanks for joining us from Halifax, Nova Scotia.